January 17, 1991. 2:38 a.m. The trackless, pitch-black expanse of the Saudi-Iraqi border. The cockpit of the AH-64 Apache was a cramped cathedral of flickering green light and high-frequency vibration that rattled the teeth of every man in
the formation.
Outside, the desert air was a biting, dry chill, smelling of ancient dust and the sharp, chemical tang of JP-8 turbine exhaust. There was no moon, no horizon, and no landmarks, just a sea of featureless silt that had swallowed armies for 3,000 years. For any other military in history, flying at 50 feet above this terrain at 100 knots would have been a suicide pact with the sand. Captain Richard "Biff" Adams tightened his grip on the cyclic. His eyes strained as he stared at the tail rotor of the MH-53 PAVE low helicopter leading his flight. In the pitch darkness, that dim glow was his only tether to the world. He was the tip of the spear of Task Force Normandy, a secret group of helicopters tasked with punching a hole in the most sophisticated air defense network in the Middle East. If they failed, the hundreds of American jets following behind them would be shredded by Iraqi radar-guided missiles before they even reached Baghdad. The Iraqis felt safe. They had built their defense around an ironclad logic. No one could navigate the deep desert at night with enough precision to find a specific radar site buried in the dunes. They believed the desert was an impassable wall, a shield of empty space that would force the Americans to stick to known roads and predictable corridors. They were still fighting a war where luck was a factor, where the lucky shot or the lucky break decided who went home. They did not know, what the world was about to discover, is that you cannot hide in the dark from something that has already mapped the darkness. What they didn't realize was that for the Americans, the ground no longer mattered. Richard Adams wasn't looking at the sand. He was looking at a small glowing screen that was communicating with a constellation of steel and atomic clocks 11,000 miles above his head. You see, for most of human history, war was an exercise in probability. In World War II, it took an average of 9,000 bombs to hit a single target. Even in Vietnam, pilots often had to fly 3 or 4 missions against the same bridge, hoping the wind, the dive angle, and the sheer volume of high explosives would eventually result in a direct hit. It was a brutal game of close enough. Commanders didn't talk about hitting a window, they talked about hitting a city block. Luck was the silent third partner in every tactical plan. But as Captain Adams watched the digits on his display count down with cold, mathematical certainty, the era of the lucky shot was drawing its final breath. To the Iraqi radar operators at the Masalan site, the desert was silent. Their screens were clear. They were looking for the roar of 1940s-style massed formations or the predictable patterns of 1970s recon flights. They expected the Americans to be lost, struggling with maps and compasses in the blowing silt. But the Americans were no longer guessing. Every 60 seconds, 4 Navstar satellites were whispering the exact geometry of the universe to the PAVE lows leading the way. What the Iraqis viewed as a trackless waste, the Americans viewed as a digital grid. It was the first time in history that a soldier knew exactly where he was, to within meters, anywhere on the planet. This wasn't just a new tool, it was a fundamental reorganization of reality. It was the transition from volume of fire to certainty of impact. Adams checked his weapon system. The Hellfire missiles were slaved to his sensors, waiting for the signal. He could feel the weight of history in the vibration of the airframe. Behind him, the American industrial machine wasn't just bringing more tanks or more planes. It was bringing a localized miracle of accuracy. They were about to turn a 1,000-mile journey into a surgical strike on a specific set of coordinates that had been calculated before the helicopters even took off. The teaching pause here is vital to understand. Most people think GPS was just a better map.
It wasn't.
It was the death of the fog of war. It meant that if you knew where the enemy was, he was already dead. The Iraqis thought their radar stations were safe because they were hidden by the horizon and the night. The truth was, in the new American century, the horizon was no longer an obstacle. As the countdown hit 0, Adams felt the Apache lurch as the first Hellfire left the rail. It didn't arc blindly into the night. It didn't hope to find a target.
It was destined for it.
The era of the lucky shot was over. The era of precision had begun. And as the first explosion tore through the silence of the Iraqi desert, the geometry of global power shifted forever. That first explosion at the Masalan radar site didn't just shatter concrete and steel. It blew a hole in the very concept of how humanity had conducted war for 5,000 years. But to understand the localized miracle in the Iraqi desert, we have to travel back to a time when America, for all its colossal industrial might, was effectively fighting blind. We have to go back to the humid jungles of Vietnam and the sterile hallways of the Pentagon in the early 1970s. where the greatest revolution in military history was almost choked to death in its cradle by a lack of vision. You see, before GPS, navigation was a messy human art form, not a science. In World War II, a navigator sat in the nose of a B-17 with a plexiglass dome and a sextant, trying to shoot the stars while flak erupted around him. If it was cloudy, he was guessing. By Vietnam, we had improved, but only slightly. We had systems like LORAN, long-range navigation, which relied on massive, land-based radio towers. But LORAN had a fatal flaw: it only worked near the coasts, it was prone to interference from the weather. And it was about as accurate as a blindfolded dart thrower in a hurricane. In the triple canopy jungles of Southeast Asia, American pilots were often frustrated to the point of tears. They had the fastest jets and the bravest men, but if they were off by just a fraction of a degree over 100 miles of featureless green canopy, they would drop their ordnance on an empty patch of forest while the target remained untouched. The lucky shot wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. The truth was, the world's most powerful military had a bottleneck, and that bottleneck was the map. Enter Colonel Brad Parkinson of the United States Air Force. In 1973, Parkinson was a man obsessed with a problem that most of his superiors didn't even think was a problem. In the bomber-first culture of the Pentagon, generals wanted bigger engines, thicker armor, and more explosive yield. When Parkinson walked into meeting rooms to talk about clocks in space, he was often met with rolled eyes and polite requests to leave the room so the real warriors could talk about hardware. Why, a general once asked him, would the American taxpayer spend billions of dollars to put a clock in orbit? We have watches, Brad. Get us a better missile. What the bomber mafia didn't understand, and what Parkinson knew in his bones, was that a missile is only as good as its address. You see, most people think the hardest part of war is the explosion.
It isn't.
The hardest part is the geometry. If you know exactly where you are and exactly where the enemy is, the explosion is just a formality. The doubt surrounding what would become the global positioning system was systemic. It was seen as a utility, a boring piece of infrastructure that didn't shoot back or look cool on a recruitment poster. The Navy had their own system called transit, which worked for slow-moving submarines but was useless for a jet moving at Mach 2. The Army had their own ideas, and the Air Force was skeptical of anything they couldn't physically fly. It was a bureaucratic nightmare where three different branches were fighting over pieces of a puzzle they didn't realize they were already holding. Parkinson's challenge wasn't just technical, it was psychological. He had to convince a generation of commanders who had grown up with paper maps and grease pencils that the future of American dominance lay in a medium they couldn't see, touch, or hear. He was fighting for a system that wouldn't even be fully operational for another 20 years. The engineering problem was even more daunting. To get an accurate position on a fast-moving aircraft, you didn't just need to know where a satellite was. You needed to know the exact time it took for a signal to travel from that satellite to your receiver at the speed of light. We are talking about measurements in nanoseconds, billionths of a second. If your clock was off by even a tiny fraction, your position on the ground would be off by miles. Most people think of space as a vacuum where things are simple. The reality was that Parkinson's team had to account for things that defy common sense, like Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. Because the satellites are moving so fast and are further away from the Earth's gravity, time actually moves differently for them than it does for us on the ground. If the engineers didn't account for that time dilation, the GPS system would fail within minutes. Think about the irony of that for a moment. America was trying to build a weapon of war that required mastering the very fabric of time and space. As the 1970s bled into the 80s, the program, then called Navstar, constantly sat on the chopping block. It was too expensive.
It was too complex.
It was too theoretical. But Parkinson and a small band of true believers at the skunk works of navigation stayed the course. They drank scorched coffee in windowless offices, staring at drag coefficients and orbital resonances. Convinced that if they could just get the constellation into the sky, the world would never be the same. They were building a lighthouse that didn't just shine light, it whispered the truth of where you stood in the universe. They were preparing to take the luck out of warfare and replace it with the cold, unyielding precision of the stars. But in those early years, as the first experimental satellites were launched into the silent void, most of the world, including the enemy, just saw it as an expensive science project. They had no idea that the lucky shot was already on its deathbed. The void of medium Earth orbit is a lonely, hostile place, 11,000 miles above the clouds. It is a realm where the sun's unshielded radiation is a constant hammer and the cold of the shadows is absolute. It was here, in this unforgiving silence, that American engineers decided to place their most precious cargo. A series of clocks that would change the destiny of nations. But these weren't the clocks you find on a mantle or a wrist. These were the most precise instruments ever conceived by the human mind, atomic clocks capable of measuring time with a drift of less than 1/1000th of a second per day. You see, the secret to GPS isn't actually positioning. That's a common misconception. The secret is synchronization. To understand why, you have to understand the staggering speed of light. Light, and the radio signals these satellites send, travels at about 186,000 miles per second. If a satellite's clock is off by just 1,000th of a second, the GPS receiver on your dashboard or in a cruise missile will be off by nearly 200 miles. To hit a specific window in Baghdad from 1,000 miles away, close enough isn't a measurement. You need perfection. What the engineers at the Joint Program Office, a small motley crew of visionaries from the Air Force, Navy, and Army, realized was that they weren't building a navigation system. They were building a global timing standard. They were turning the entire planet into a giant, invisible laboratory where every point on the surface could be measured against the heartbeat of an atom. But there was another problem, one that almost no one talks about. To tell someone where they are on Earth, you first have to know exactly what the Earth looks like.
And the truth? The Earth is a mess.
It's not a perfect sphere, it's a lumpy potato of varying density and irregular curves. This is where the human brilliance of American engineering truly shone. While the public was focused on the Apollo moon landings, a brilliant mathematician named Gladys West was quietly working at the Naval Surface Warfare Center in Virginia. Gladys wasn't building rockets, she was building a mathematical model of the world. She processed staggering amounts of data from early satellites to account for the gravitational lumps that pull on everything from water to
satellites.
Without Gladys West's calculations of the geoid, the true shape of the Earth, the GPS constellation would have been a billion-dollar mistake. It would have been like trying to use a ruler made of rubber. In the late 1970s and early 80s, the development was shrouded in the kind of quiet, professional secrecy that defines American industrial peaks. We weren't just building satellites, we were building the infrastructure to launch them, track them, and constantly upload the truth to them. The technical breakdown of a Navstar satellite is a testament to what happens when American industry is given an impossible goal. Each bird carried multiple atomic clocks, rubidium and cesium, working in a redundant chorus.
If one tick faltered, the others took over.
They were designed to survive the vacuum for years, shielded from the electromagnetic pulses of potential nuclear war. This wasn't a civilian convenience, it was a strategic asset designed to ensure that even in the apocalypse, the United States military would know exactly where it was standing. You see, the engineers would explain during those early skeptical briefings, 3 satellites give us a point on a map. That's latitude and longitude. But 3 aren't enough for war.
We need 4. Why 4? For the 4th dimension, time.
A GPS receiver doesn't have an atomic clock inside it, that would cost millions of dollars and weigh several hundred pounds. Instead, the 4th satellite acts as a master synchronizer. It tells the cheap receiver on the ground, your clock is slightly wrong. Here is the true time of the universe. Once the ground receiver's clock is slave to the satellites, the geometry clicks into place. The triangle becomes a fixed point. Within seconds, the receiver knows its position, its altitude, and its velocity. It was a revelation that changed the very nature of military power. By the mid-1980s, we began launching the Block II satellites. These were the workhorses. They were heavier, more durable, and carried a secret that the Soviet Union couldn't replicate, the selective availability feature. This was the ultimate irony of GPS. America was building a system that would eventually be free for the whole world, but for the military, we kept a high-resolution version. The civilians got a signal accurate to 100 meters, enough to find a park. The U.S. military got a signal accurate to the width of a sidewalk. As the first 10, then 15, then 20 satellites moved into their orbits, a silent, invisible grid began to settle over the Earth. The Soviet Union watched, their own system, GLONASS, struggling with inferior electronics and failing clocks. They couldn't match the purity of the American signal because they couldn't match the precision of American manufacturing. You see, you can copy a bomb, and you can steal a blueprint for a tank. But you cannot steal the collective brilliance required to make an atom dance to your tune 11,000 miles in the sky. By 1989, the constellation was nearing its completion. The world was still peaceful, and the experts were still calling GPS a white elephant that would never be used in a real conflict.
They mocked the cost.
They mocked the complexity. They didn't know that 3 years later, the sand of the Middle East would prove that the white elephant was actually the most deadly weapon in the American arsenal. When the clock finally struck midnight on the 17th of January, 1991, the Iraqi military commanders were waiting for a war they understood. They were waiting for a repeat of the bloody static slugfest of the 1980s. Massive artillery barrages, entrenched lines and frontal assaults. They looked at their tactical maps of the western desert and saw an emptiness that comforted them. They saw a flank that was protected by the terrain itself, a 600-mile waste of trackless, shifting sand where no vehicle could drive for more than an hour without becoming hopelessly lost.
They called it the dead zone.
They were waiting for a 20th-century enemy. They didn't realize they were facing a 21st-century god. You see, for the Iraqi army, the desert was a place of ghosts and guesses, where even the stars were often hidden by the blowing Shamil dust storms. For the American military, that same desert was a high-speed expressway marked with invisible digital neon. The truth was that while the Iraqis were trying to navigate with paper maps and 1950s Soviet compasses, the Americans were moving with a live data feed from the future. The hero of this story isn't a tank or a jet, though they were the ones doing the shooting. The hero was a tan-colored brick-sized plastic box called the AN/PSN-10, known to the troops as the SLGR or Slugger. Technically, it was a small lightweight GPS receiver. In reality, it was a magic wand. Before the war began, the Pentagon realized they didn't have enough for every unit.
Panic set in.
In a move that highlights the agility of American brilliance, the military started buying every civilian GPS unit they could find, literally clearing the shelves of boat shops and hiking stores across the United States. General Norman Schwarzkopf, the commander of the coalition forces, had a plan that relied entirely on those little boxes. It was called the Great Left Hook. He wanted to move 2 entire Army Corps, more than 200,000 men and thousands of tanks, deep into that impassable western desert, bypassing the Iraqi front lines entirely and slamming into their rear. Most people think of the left hook as a feat of logistics.
It was.
But more than that, it was a feat of space power. Imagine being an Iraqi colonel stationed in the desert. You are 300 miles from the nearest road. You believe you are safe because you are invisible. Then suddenly, out of a blinding dust storm, an entire division of American M1 Abrams tanks appears on your horizon. They didn't come from the road. They came from the dead zone. They are moving at 40 miles per hour, and they are exactly where they are supposed to be.
They aren't lost.
They aren't guessing. They are driving on a digital rail provided by the Navstar constellation. One captured Iraqi officer later told his interrogators, "We didn't think anyone could find this place. We thought we were alone in the world. How did you know where the ridge was? How did you know where our fuel depot was buried?" The answer was simple, but for the Iraqis, it was inconceivable. The Americans didn't just have a map of the desert. They owned the very idea of location. Then came the ventilation shaft moment. While the tanks were rewriting the rules of land warfare in the desert, the world was watching CNN in stunned silence. We all remember the grainy footage of a laser-guided bomb flying down the air shaft of an Iraqi ministry building or into a specific hardened aircraft.
Shelter.
What the public didn't understand, and what the enemy was beginning to realize in a state of sheer terror, was that the bomb wasn't smart just because it had a laser. It was smart because the aircraft that dropped it knew its exact position to within inches at the moment of release. The GPS signal had refined the bombing calculations to such an extent that the circular error probable, the military term for accuracy, had shrunk from the size of a stadium to the size of a dinner plate. You see, most people think precision warfare is about the explosion.
It's not.
It's about the geometry of the kill. Because the American pilots knew their position in the fourth dimension, time, they could coordinate strikes from 12 different directions to hit the same target at the exact same second. The Iraqis had the fourth largest army in the world and the densest air defense network in the Middle East.
It didn't matter.
You cannot defend against a ghost that hits you from every angle simultaneously with surgical grace. The epiphany for the world came on that first night.
The lucky shot was dead.
In its place was a system of American dominance that relied on the marriage of space-age engineering and battlefield grit. As the Iraqi soldiers abandoned their tanks in the desert, they weren't just running from fire. They were running from a technological superiority they couldn't even name. They thought they were fighting men. They were actually fighting a constellation. And as the sun rose over the burning oil fields of Kuwait, the message was clear to every world capital from Moscow to Beijing. If you go to war with the United States, you can run and you can hide, but you will only die tired. After the smoke cleared in Kuwait in 1991, the world's military planners returned to their drawing boards in a state of quiet panic. They had seen the future, and it was terrifyingly accurate. They had witnessed an entire army, the fourth largest on Earth, evaporate in a matter of weeks, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked coordinates. However, while the rest of the world was still trying to figure out how to build their own satellite constellations, America was already moving to the next stage of the revolution. We weren't satisfied with just knowing where we were. We wanted to integrate that certainty into every single bullet, bomb, and breadcrumb of the American military machine. The 1990s and early 2000s saw the birth of what we now call systemic dominance. This was the moment when GPS stopped being a tool and started becoming the oxygen of the American way of war. You see, the most brilliant part of American engineering isn't always the most expensive part. Take, for example, the JDAM, the Joint Direct Attack Munition. In the years following the Gulf War, American engineers looked at the thousands of dumb iron bombs left over from the Cold War, massive 2,000-pound slabs of steel that were essentially just heavy paperweights with explosives inside. Instead of throwing them away and building million-dollar superweapons, America did something far more clever. We built a $20,000 tail kit. What the JDAM kit did was simple but revolutionary. It slapped a GPS brain and steerable fins onto the back of a 50-year-old bomb. Suddenly, a piece of stupid metal from the 1950s became a precision-guided instrument of death that could be dropped from 30,000 feet through thick clouds and hit a specific street corner with zero visibility. Most people don't realize how much this changed the math of war. During the Vietnam War, if you wanted to destroy a bridge, you had to fly dozens of sorties and drop hundreds of bombs, risking dozens of pilots. By the time we reached the 2003 invasion of Iraq, a single B-2 Spirit bomber could take off from Missouri, fly halfway around the world, and strike 16 different targets with 16 different dams in a single pass.
One plane. One pass.
16 dead targets. That is the industrial edge that keeps our adversaries awake at night. But the systemic dominance went deeper than just bombs. It moved into the hands of every 19-year-old private in the infantry. We developed what was called blue force tracking. You see, the fog of war has been the primary cause of military failure since the dawn of time. Commanders never knew where their own men were, leading to confusion, friendly fire, and missed opportunities.
GPS fixed that.
For the first time in human history, a general sitting in a climate-controlled tent in Qatar could look at a digital screen and see every single American tank, truck, and squad as a moving icon on a satellite map. Knowledge, as the old saying goes, is power. But in the American military, knowledge is a weapon system. By integrating GPS into everything from the Blue Force Tracker to the M1 Abrams tank's fire control system, we created a digital net that connected the heavens to the earth. And that brings us to the strategic edge that no other nation can truly replicate, the ground segment. It's easy to look at the satellites and be impressed. But the real secret to why American GPS is the gold standard is the infrastructure on the ground. At Schriever Air Force Base in Colorado, the men and women of the 2nd Space Operations Squadron act as the world's timekeepers. They don't just watch the satellites, they nurse them. They are constantly monitoring the atomic health of every bird in the constellation. You see, because the Earth's gravity isn't uniform and because the sun's radiation pressure literally pushes the satellites out of their paths, the truth of the GPS signal has to be corrected multiple times a day.
If the U.S.
Air Force walked away from those control stations, the global GPS system would start to drift within hours. Your bank transactions would fail, your power grid would desync, and the precision of our missiles would revert to the lucky shot era. America provides this oxygen of the modern world for free to everyone on the planet, but we are the only ones who know how to keep the air pure. What the world discovered is that GPS isn't just a military asset, it's a foundational pillar of global civilization. It's in the container ships that move our goods, the tractors that plant our food, and the servers that run our internet. It is a testament to American brilliance that we built something so vital, so powerful, and so reliable that the rest of the world stopped even thinking about it. They just assume it will always be there, like the sun rising in the east. But for those who understand the history of warfare, the message is different. This systemic dominance means that the United States doesn't just fight on the battlefield.
We fight in the fourth dimension.
We own the time, we own the location, and we own the geometry of the fight. And as long as those 24 Navstar satellites are whispering the truth to the world, the American century remains written in the stars. If you stand in the middle of the Iraqi desert today, the silence is absolute. The craters of the 1991 war have been filled by the shifting silt of the decades. And the radar sites that once pulsed with the frantic energy of an empire are now nothing but rusted skeletons of rebar and scorched earth. But if you look up at the night sky, the same deep, velvet sky that once guided ancient caravans and Sumerian astronomers. You aren't just looking at the constellations of old. You are looking at the silent, silver sentinels of the American spirit. You are looking at the Navstar constellation, still circling the Earth every 12 hours, still whispering the same cold, mathematical truths to a world that has forgotten how to be lost. The legacy of the global positioning system isn't just about winning a war in 100 hours. It is about a fundamental shift in the human condition. You see, for all of human history, to be in the fog of war was to be in a state of moral and tactical chaos. When you cannot see your enemy, and when you do not know where you stand, you resort to the volume of sorrow. You drop 10,000 bombs because you cannot be sure of one. You fire 1,000 shells because the target is a guess. The lucky shot was a tragedy dressed in the clothes of a miracle. What American brilliance did with GPS was something far more profound than just improving accuracy. We took the luck out of the equation and replaced it with intent. We replaced the statistical probability of death with the certainty of a mission accomplished. For the veteran who lived through the transition from paper maps to digital screens, the change was more than technological, it was spiritual. It was the moment we stopped fighting the terrain and started commanding it. There is a quiet, humble pride in the fact that the most powerful weapon in the world isn't a bomb that levels a city, but a clock that tells the truth. Think about the sheer scale of the gift America gave to the world. We spent billions of dollars, we risked our finest minds, and we launched our most advanced technology into the void of space, and then we gave the keys to everyone. Today, a farmer in Ukraine, a ship captain in the South China Sea, and a grandfather driving his grandkids to a ballgame in Ohio all rely on the same American hardware. Every time you look at your phone to find your way home, you are touching a lineage of engineering that began with a few true believers in a windowless office in 1973. The world has become a smaller, safer, and more connected place because America decided that the era of being lost was over. We didn't just build a map, we built a global nervous system. We turned the very fabric of time into a utility that powers everything from the electricity in your walls to the money in your pocket. But for those of us who remember the green glow of the first Slugger units in the desert, the reflection goes deeper. We remember the look on the faces of the Iraqi prisoners who thought they were hidden by the night. We remember the ventilation shaft footage that proved American brilliance could do the impossible. We realize that GPS was the final piece of the puzzle that made the American military the most formidable force in the history of the world, not because we had more men, but because we had more clarity. You see, the enemy's misconception wasn't just about a radar site or a desert flank. Their mistake was believing that the lucky shot was a law of nature. They didn't understand that to a nation of engineers, a law of nature is just a problem waiting for a solution. They brought the ideology of the past, believing that the darkness would protect them. We brought the mathematics of the future, proving that for America, there is no such thing as darkness. Today, those satellites are still up there, 11,000 miles in the sky, performing their invisible dance. They are the lighthouses of the 21st century, beacons of American ingenuity that will continue to shine long after the wars of our time are forgotten. They are a reminder that when we set our minds to a problem, we don't just change the map, we change the way the world moves. They brought the desert.
We brought the stars.
And in the silence after the last GPS signal pings, the lesson remains written in the heavens: you can hide from a man. You can hide from a machine. But you can never hide from the truth of where you stand.
They brought myths. We brought math.